Many months ago, when we began planning this fall's convocation, we thought about what would be an appropriate subject matter to bring to your attention. And it seemed to us that, considering the position the United States finds itself in the world today, and considering the number of conflicts springing forth around the world into which we might subsequently be drawn, a speaker who could focus on American foreign policy would be altogether appropriate. Samantha Power, our convocation speaker this evening, has written a book which has enormous public impact on a topic of indisputable political and ethical significance in the subject matter of U.S. foreign policy. Many of you in the audience will identify with pieces of her background. An immigrant from Ireland, as it happens, she attended public schools and developed a passion there for athletics, so it's rather fitting that we find ourselves in the Remac Arena tonight. She remains an avid sports fan, especially of baseball, and you all need to know what pain, in some ways, it might cause to be missing this evening's Red Sox-Yankees game because the Red Sox are her team. Fresh out of Yale, she went to work for the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C. as a research assistant for Morton Abramovitz, who appears in her book as a public official with rare personal integrity. Through her work at the endowment, she learned much more about what was then happening in Bosnia and traveled there to break into journalism as a freelancer. Her research and writing skills led her to positions as a correspondent for U.S. News and World Report, for The Economist, and for some stories with The Washington Post, all of this between 1993 and 1996. As a student at Harvard Law School, keep this in mind, as a student at Harvard Law School, she worked full-time and wrote the book, which won her the Pulitzer Prize earlier this year, A Problem from Hell, America and the Age of Genocide. Her book is a marvelous combination of sustained objective research into the facts and passionate normative judgment about what U.S. foreign policy should be in her view. Now a lecturer in public policy at the Kennedy School and the founding executive director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at Harvard, please welcome Samantha Power.
Red Sox are winning 4-0, I'm told. What I want to know is, why is it when I tell my students that something is mandatory, they don't come? And that here somehow there seems to be a greater adherence to faculty recommendations and edicts. It's a great pleasure to be with you on a special evening that honors you, the students, first and foremost, at this special school. By implication, Eleanor Roosevelt, the great dame who gave one of your colleges its name, and who I think set a standard for how we should all act in the face of injustice. Let me say a few words about Eleanor. I write about bystanders. That's sort of what I do. But Mrs. Roosevelt was anything but. She was an upstander. She stood up against racial injustice at home, and she stood up for human rights abroad. Some of you may have studied her lasting creation, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which in 1948 bound states together to promote, respect, and protect human rights. It was well ahead of its time. But it is best to judge individuals, I think, not merely on the basis of their official achievements, but also according to how they respond to the injustices that confront them in everyday life. And here again, Roosevelt was ahead of her time. When she went to attend a meeting in 1938 in Birmingham, Alabama, and was prohibited by a segregation ordinance from sitting with her black friends, she promptly decided to take her chair from over there where the white people were and plopped it squarely in the aisle between the black and the white sections. Her commitment to grand gestures, such as that one, never got in the way of her concern for the actual individuals in whose name we claim to be fighting. Once, when walking through Greenwich Village in a rainstorm at a time in the United States of severe racial tension, she was hit by a station wagon, which actually backed over her, tearing several ligaments in her leg. Her first reaction was not what most of ours would have been, which would have been to get out and yell and scream, because she immediately noticed that the driver of the car was black. So instead of yelling and screaming about her torn ligaments and the fact that the station wagon was parked somewhere near her knee, she stood up, kind of, and urged the driver to flee as soon as possible and to escape the scene of the crime. It's humbling to speak at a school dedicated to her legacy. My remarks today are going to center on America's role in the world in this, the age of terror and genocide. But knowing how many of you here are undergraduates, I'm actually not going to bore you with policy speak. Instead, I'm going to try to inspire you to become citizens of the world, but just as importantly, to become citizens of this country, to become, shall we say, upstanders in a world that is sadly crowded with bystanders. Lest you think that anybody who ends up speaking at you from behind a podium was destined to do so, let me tell you a little about my journey to this curious perch. Soon after I graduated from college, I went to Berlin for 6 months to teach English. The wall had recently fallen, and East and West Berliners were getting reacquainted after decades of separation. But the city's most noticeable feature was, for the second time in a century, its refugees. This time they weren't Jewish, they were Muslim. They were Bosnian Muslim. I'd never seen a refugee before. My parents, as was mentioned, are Irish, and I immigrated with them to America from Ireland at the age of 9. But refugees are very different from immigrants. The people who tumbled into Berlin were fleeing for their lives. They were filthy, they were needy, and they were angry. Many were reliving the horrors they had experienced: concentration camps, rape camps, little boys and girls picked off their bicycles by Sarajevo snipers. Yet these refugees caused me then to do only one thing: walk as quickly as I could in the opposite direction. I saw only people I had no capacity to help. And very quickly, as a way of easing, or perhaps preempting the guilt, I told myself the same story that American politicians were using at the time. Bosnia was a problem from hell, I said. We could never make these people like one another. They had been killing one another for centuries. If something is a problem from hell, it places little burden on outsiders to problem solve. I lacked something very important in those days: sight. In Invisible Man, Ralph Ellison writes about the peculiar disposition behind the whites of the eyes, a disposition that blinds us to injustice before us, that causes us to look through people. And we are never more prone to look away than when we don't want to face the implications of what we might see. I returned to the United States to take up this internship that was mentioned in Washington. I happened to be assigned to work for an extraordinary man named Mort Abramowitz, who had been an assistant secretary in the US government and an ambassador. Unlike many of his colleagues who had emerged from government, he still retained the capacity for surprise. Because I worked for him, I suddenly had to lose the glaze and focus on what was going on in the Balkans, an issue which was of deep concern for him. In so doing, by focusing, by being forced to focus, I quickly came to realize what people who lived through the Holocaust had long said, that there is knowledge, and then there is knowledge. Knee-buckling knowledge. The kind that makes you cry or that knocks the wind out of you. The kind that makes you shudder as you imagine someone you love similarly situated. Because I was tasked to learn, I couldn't avert my gaze. And because I learned, I was revolted. Revolted by the crimes, but also by my country's refusal to stop them. I racked my brain for the contribution that a well-meaning 22-year-old could make. Like many, a liberal arts graduate, and indeed many UCSD student, I had no skills. I had no medical training, I couldn't rebuild demolished houses, and I had only an intern's wages to give away. Then I remembered that I had in fact learned how to do one thing in college, and that was to write. Remembering that led me to the first of many unreasonable leaps. Since I could write, I thought, I'll move to Bosnia and become a journalist. I called the UN headquarters in the former Yugoslavia and learned that to get accredited, I needed a letter from a major Western news outlet. Who did I know? Nobody. But luckily, the offices of U.S. News and World Report were in the building where I worked. I marched downstairs and studied the nameplates on the doors, and when I came to the door with the plate marked Chief of Correspondence, I poked my head inside and mumbled something about wanting to cover the wars in the former Yugoslavia. The skeptic, seated at his desk, asked a few questions. "What is your current job?" he asked. I'm an intern," I said. This was before being an intern was controversial in Washington. "I'm an intern," I said. "Your reporting experience?" he asked. "I cover the Yale women's volleyball team for a season," I said. "Your language skills?" "Bad Spanish." "Your war experience?" I said, "Well, the usual. I lived through a divorce as a child." "Did I have a flak jacket?" No, but I said, but living in Washington, I had in fact just learned what a flak was, a press spokesperson. I didn't understand why I would need a press spokesperson's jacket to cover the war in Bosnia. He was unimpressed, and he said the magazine already had a correspondent in Europe who covered the Balkans. Undaunted, as I left, I asked him if he would take my collect phone calls if I telephoned from Bosnia with an idea. He shrugged and nodded. And as I left, even though the meeting had been a disaster, I pumped my fist into light and began packing for my 2-week vacation. Because I was determined, all I could hear was what I wanted to hear. He would take my phone calls. When I reached Bosnia, there was no shortage of news or feature stories. The chief of correspondence kept his word, took my phone calls, and eventually even liked one of my ideas. In 1993, a year after graduating from Yale, U.S. News published my first article, a 600-word box. Now, having published one piece, I made a second unreasonable leap. I was sure I could become a full-time war correspondent. I called the Boston Globe because of my affiliation for the Red Sox. And by then, I had managed to learn some of the lingo. Did they need a stringer? I asked. Polished. They weren't sure. They asked me to send them my best clip. My best clip? Why, I happen to have found just the one. My 600-word box was promptly placed in the mail as if there were many behind it. This story presents, I think, a couple lessons that might be of use to you, those of you who are thinking about doing something in public service or humanitarianism, but who feel a little disempowered by the state of the world and the unclear career paths that might take you in the direction that you want to head. First, I would say don't let your understanding of what is possible or realistic interfere with your understanding of what is desirable. Be, I suppose, unreasonable. And second, don't underestimate what you have to offer. We're actually all generalists now. And with the values that brought you to UCSD and the thinking and writing skills they teach you here, you will be, in fact, equipped to do good. I lived in the former Yugoslavia for 2 years, and it was my experience there that led me to write the book that I think earned me this invite. The sight of concentration camps in Europe in the 1990s made me wonder, did the phrase "never again" in fact simply mean never again will Germans kill Jews in Europe between 1939 and 1945? Why do we seem to do so little about genocide and yet continue to believe that we as a country and that we as citizens would act if confronted by this crime? I spent around 5 years exploring the U.S. response to genocide and will just briefly here summarize the pattern that I discovered. The cases I looked at were the slaughter of the Armenians in Turkey in 1915, the Holocaust, of course, the killing of 2 million Cambodians in the late 1970s under Pol Pot, the murder of some 200,000 Iraqi Kurds by chemical weapons use and by traditional executions in the late 1980s. This genocide we've been hearing a lot about lately. The Rwandan genocide, the systematic slaughter of 800,000 Tutsi. And, of course, the Bosnian killings, which I've already mentioned. The pattern in the U.S. response was disturbing. Despite extensive early warnings ahead of the killing and detailed knowledge during, the United States did very little to try to address the slaughter. Now, let me say that when I say very little, I mean very little. What was surprising to me was not that the U.S. didn't send its troops into harm's way. What shocked me was that the U.S. leaders very rarely even denounced the killings while they occurred. Senior officials devoted little time to figuring out what to do. So the issue was left to low-level bureaucrats to try to muster a response. And these bureaucrats didn't impose economic penalties, didn't freeze the foreign assets of the perpetrators of genocide. One thing I've learned about genocidaires, they really, really like money. And yet, their foreign assets were left unfrozen and for their use. The U.S. officials didn't use our technology to jam the radio, hate radio, or the television that was being used to propagate the necessary hate, and even to communicate the names and the addresses of the would-be victims. These officials didn't threaten to punish the perpetrators of genocide, trying to sort of deter them or at least get inside their heads so they might just think twice or thrice before doing what they were about to do, and what I should say they had never done before. Most perpetrators of genocide have never, ever killed before. They didn't exert American leadership to rally troops from other countries, to perhaps create safe havens for petrified refugees. You name it, and for the most part, to my shock anyway, it is true that the United States passed up the opportunity to do it. The best indicator, I think, of the subliminal guilt that U.S. policymakers experienced while doing so little was their persistent refusal to use the word genocide to describe the crimes underway. It was as if they didn't want to remind the American people or themselves that they were, in fact, standing idly by again in the face of the crimes that they had pledged themselves to stop. They weren't living up to the post-Holocaust commitments, and they didn't like that. And so they chose to recharacterize the violence in a very different way. Now, you might wonder, as I did, having said all this, why it was that U.S. leaders of all political stripes, this is not a partisan question, really, and certainly of all personalities and really from virtually all time periods in the 20th century, why? Why would we respond this way? The answer, I think, actually tells us a lot about U.S. leadership in the world. And tells us a lot, I think, also about how we might rethink the way that we're fighting the so-called war on terrorism. First of all, and this was something that always troubled Eleanor Roosevelt, actually, the default presumption when it comes to U.S. foreign policy is that foreign policy is crafted for one reason, and that is to advance U.S. interests, U.S. economic and security interests, period. If foreign policy were to benefit American values, great, all the better. But it's not there for that. Any effect on our values or on morals or on human rights, for the most part, is seen to be incidental. And after all, think about it. Our representatives in government weren't, in fact, elected to look out for foreign citizens. They are chosen to help us. And perhaps, unfortunately for contemporary victims of genocide, preventing genocide is not something that directly impacts upon the lives of Americans, at least within the term of an election cycle. It usually doesn't. So genocide, remarkably, for all of the talk of never again, doesn't actually make the cut in terms of what foreign policy is for. Of course, having said this is the default presumption. There are two ways that this default presumption can give way, and that other priorities can sort of be put on the list of things to do. First, a president could, of course, exert leadership. Now, this could be moral leadership, you know, the kind that just ranks genocide as a priority as such, or it could be enlightened self-interest, where he, or maybe eventually she, makes the case that actually doing something about a crime of this magnitude will benefit Americans in the long term, will advance traditional conceptions of self-interest. For all of the remembering of the Holocaust, and I think presidents have played a pivotal role in this country, going to the Holocaust Museum, having the museum set up on the Mall with Washington and Jefferson and Lincoln, and they've, you know, held screenings of Schindler's List, and they've said never again, and they've done a terrific job commemorating. But for all of that leadership on the Holocaust, there's been very little at all, top down, on the subject of genocide. None, in fact, no president has ever really staked his credibility or delivered leadership on responding to genocide. Of course, there's a second way that we could bring about change in the default presumption, or at least get something added to that list, and that's bottom-up political pressure. That's where we come in. This could mean protests or campus rallies, phone calls to our congresspeople, money for charities, editorials, letters to the editors, prompting of hearings before Congress. So many ways of expressing community outrage. And yet, unfortunately, with the one exception of the genocide in Bosnia, which, with its concentration camps, I think evoked such strong memories of the Holocaust, but with the one exception of that case, no such pressure has really been forthcoming from the rest of us, from those of us outside government. And as a result, no American president or legislator has ever really believed that they would pay a price politically for being a bystander to genocide. They think that if something matters to their constituents, that eventually they'll hear about it. And yet, of course, genocide is not a voting issue. This isn't an issue that most of you, even those of you who are most outraged, let's say, by the response to Rwanda, how many of you placed your vote, either in the Gore-Bush election or in the prior election with Clinton on the basis of his response to Rwanda? Well, presidents know this. And so while there might be a passive constituency that actually believes in doing the right thing or doing something, that constituency tends not to get out of its chairs. Now, you can probably see why all of this talk of genocide matters for future victims of genocide. But you might wonder what it has to do with you. Well, for starters, I think that it's you or we as citizens who are the ones who will both benefit or pay a long-term price for the decisions made by our leaders in the realm of foreign policy. And second, I think our alienation from foreign policy as citizens is having a profound negative impact on American security. I think it's time that we reverse course. It's a truism, what I said earlier, that foreign policy rarely presents voting issues. But it is not true that we voters aren't affected by the decisions of our policymakers. Let me give you a couple examples. In 1988, the U.S. government, at the time, which was under the Reagan administration, decided to look the other way when Saddam Hussein used chemical weapons against rural Kurds in northern Iraq. Some argued at the time within the government that this was genocide. Others said it wasn't, on the grounds that the term genocide should only be applied when the body count reaches 6 million or when the form of killing is mechanized, like that of the Holocaust. People really made these arguments in government. Others, of course, protested, but they were overruled. Whatever definition you choose, and it's actually something of a definitional quagmire where ethnic cleansing ends or massive human rights abuses end and genocide begins, the fact was that between 100 and 200,000 people were killed, not because of anything they had done as individuals, but simply because of who they were, what their identity was. The year after the assault, I'm ashamed to say, the United States didn't just maintain its aid to Saddam Hussein's regime. At that point, we were giving him $500 million a year in credits to buy American farm products. We didn't simply maintain that aid regime, we doubled it. The year after this gassing attack, the year after the use of these chemical weapons and the torture and the executions and so on. We also doubled a separate aid package which was for manufacturing credits to buy American manufactured goods. In mobilizing for the recent war with Iraq, the genocide against the Kurds was, of course, invoked. But wouldn't it have been more prudent to try to deter Saddam when the Kurds were still alive? Wouldn't it have been wiser to try to curb his chemical weapons program back then, before it allegedly got so big as to warrant outright war? And before, of course, it got so big as to warrant the deadly and increasingly deadly deployment of 130,000 U.S. troops. The Bosnia case, which so inspired me, presents a second example, I think, of the harmful effect of our historic tendency to exclude consideration of human rights from our foreign policy. Bosnia, as I mentioned, was a problem from hell. We were all told that. We don't have a dog in the fight, James Baker, the Secretary of State under the first George Bush, said at the time the war started. Yet we've learned since that we did, in fact, have a dog in the fight. We had a dog in a place where we let people die, and we had a dog in a place where atrocities were carried out that we turned away from. Who was it that got into Bosnia and took advantage of the murder and the mayhem and the neglect of the Western world, of the Europeans as well, and of the Americans, and of the rest of the world, the Islamic world as well? Who got in there at that time? Who would you expect to get in there and take advantage of murder and mayhem? Bin Laden got in. Bin Laden will always get in, or people like Bin Laden will get in to places like this. He set up training camps there in Bosnia. He radicalized secular Muslims who were tired of getting killed for a religion they had never practiced. And for much of the 1990s, he traveled on a Bosnian passport. Our leaders have to see that the way a regime treats its own citizens is an excellent indicator, in fact, of the kind of global citizen it can become. He may be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch, was the Cold War mantra, a mantra that is increasingly being applied to the war on terror. It is a myopic approach. In fact, our son of a bitch today will be the funder or alienator of a terrorist enemy tomorrow. The funny thing is that the ideas long written off as utopian or unrealistic, democratization, the rule of law, respect for human rights, civilian control over the military, an independent judiciary, a world in which sons of bitches are voted out of office or are incarcerated instead of hailed and paraded, these romantic, unrealistic ideas are in fact the best guarantors, the best long-term guarantors of U.S. security. I think U.S. security would best be enhanced by taking several steps. First, it's time to get back to America's strength, which is its soft power, not its hard power. Soft power, of course, is what my colleague and my boss, in fact, at the Kennedy School, a phrase he termed to describe our ability to attract others around the world, our ability to get what we want by attraction, not by coercion, our ability, in a sense, to make others want what we want. Well, for those of you, I'm not sure how many of you have traveled recently in the world, but it's really dispiriting, because right now others want what we don't want. They go out of their way. They actually kind of want what we want, but they're now going out of their way to want what we don't want. This is a problem. I think we've lost the soft power for reasons that I'll come to. I think we have to change the tone. I mean, this is quite easy. A lot of this are quick fixes. The tone of our engagement with others. It's natural, I think, to sound supercilious or just outright superior to others when you have the military budget, that's that of the next, 10 countries combined, an economy that even at its worst right now dwarfs that of any rival. But it's precisely because of this military and economic and, of course, cultural power that I think it's incumbent on us to just be a little more solicitous, a little more respectful, to listen, I guess, as well as we talk. Lately, I think that there's been a tendency, in part because, and I have to credit the Bush administration, there is more talk about liberty and about human rights and freedom than there has been in any prior administration. But there's a tendency to confuse the national and our way of life, let's say, not that that's a fixed concept, but with the universal. The president has gone on record as saying there's one single sustainable model for human development. This can't be right. We just happen to get it just right, just the first time around. I think it's very important to be soliciting other models to get, of course, at the same noble ends, where we do have liberty and freedom and respect in other cultures. Even if we don't agree with the views of our allies or even our foes, I think the approach that we had been taking, I think, in previous decades where we had all of the power but not quite the same strut, our approach then was just to be seen to be hearing people out, to be seen to be listening. Even if agreement is not forthcoming, tone and style can matter a great deal in minimizing the amount of resentment that discord creates. Third, and this is of course related, I think it's essential that we start acting less unilaterally, or at least less aggressively unilaterally. The United States has generated, I think, needless hostility by threatening to destroy the International Criminal Court, by saying outright that it would be dead on arrival. I think it's generated needless hostility by blaming the United Nations for the failure to respond to the genocides of the 1990s, when the United States was the strongest power on the Security Council and the most pivotal country in those debates. The UN will always make an easy fall guy, but alienating all of its members probably is not a good long-term route to U.S. security. I think we've generated needless resentment as well in the way that we're choosing to tackle the AIDS epidemic. Again, the Bush administration deserves significant credit for its shocking announcement in January of a $5 billion AIDS package, dwarfing any of the kinds of commitments that had been made before it. But instead of channeling this money through the new Global Health Fund for AIDS, TB, and malaria, one of the few international institutions, I have to say, that hasn't yet screwed up. Most multilateral institutions really are problematic. This one is actually doing very well. It's only been in existence for 2 years. It's hired a bunch of McKinsey consultants, so all of the paperwork is in order. None of the sort of traditional fears about international accountability yet, really have a right to take hold. And yet we choose to spend this money unilaterally. and not work through this institution where already you have countries coming to it, putting forth proposals, rigorizing the way they're thinking about launching prevention and treatment initiatives. This is gratuitous avoidance of multilateral bodies. The fact is, nobody has more to gain from a functional international system with enforceable rules of the road than the strongest power. This is a controversial statement. There are those who believe weaker powers need the rules of the road, but who generates more resentments in a world of inequalities, and to some extent of inherent inequalities, than the strongest power? And so to be seen to be embedding that power within an institution, I think would really minimize much of the resentment that's out there today. Fourth, and this is a kind of complicated but very important point, I think, I think we have to start to see the links across our decision making. I think American foreign policy making is extremely a la carte. We believe that we can make a set of arguments about why to go to war in Iraq, and that argument will be settled on the merits and demerits of our case, on the extent to which we show that there are weapons of mass destruction, the extent to which we show the abusiveness of Saddam's regime now, all these years after the original sin of genocide, of course. But the fact is, we're being judged on the basis of a much thicker assessment of U.S. foreign policy, such that our arguments about Iraq are being heard by others, rightly or wrongly, through the prism of what we do in other areas. So we think we can attack the International Criminal Court, and that it will actually not have much or not have a significant bearing on the way our arguments for, or the case that we make for the war in Iraq are going to be heard. That's just not true. We think that we can continue to back the Saudi regime and talk about human rights abuses in Iraq and not have people doubt that human rights is in fact a driving motive for our war in Iraq. The a la cartism that we bring, and by a la cartism I mean we deal one by one, issue by issue, I think is belied by the way most people actually look at the whole picture on the international stage. And I think the inconsistencies, many of which can't be avoided, but all of which must be acknowledged, have left people confused and outright suspicious. And I think if we took a more systemic approach, we could cure that. Fifth, we must recognize that history matters. While there's something admirable in the forward-looking, can-do American spirit, I think it's really important to remember that the clock doesn't start with us anew. And by us, I mean us as citizens, but also us as policymakers, people who go into government. We inherit in the eyes of the rest of the world the policies of our predecessors. If we aren't willing to look back and to concede that the United States may have done wrong here or there, I think it's going to be very difficult for us ever to get the kind of clean slate that we presume we acquire when we move into a place, or even just when we commence a meeting with a person. Let me give you a recent example. In Iraq, about 2 weeks ago, Colin Powell visited the town of Halabja. Now, Halabja was the scene in 1988 of the most horrific chemical weapons attack that Saddam carried out in his entire undistinguished tenure. 5,000 Kurds were killed in one single 24-hour chemical attack. Colin Powell, unfortunately, was Ronald Reagan's national security advisor at the time of this attack. And again, this was at a time when we doubled our aid to Saddam's regime in the aftermath of acquiring full knowledge of the goriness and the horrificness of this massacre. Colin Powell visited the site, paid one of the more moving tributes that a U.S. official could pay to the victims, to the fallen, to the tragedy, and made no mention, offered no explanation of why we had a different view of Saddam at that time. I'm not saying that people would have accepted our logic, which was, of course, that Iran was the greater neighborhood enemy. But for us to act again and again as if people haven't noticed where we were, on whose side we were, I think does a disservice to the perspicacity, to the powers of observation of people around the world. And it's tempting to think that they're not noticing, because for the most part we're not noticing them. But that, again, is one of the collateral consequences of being a hyperpower. You're noticed. Your words and deeds have ripple effects that can become even tidal waves. Sixth, and coming here to the end of my the power doctrine for the reform of U.S. foreign policy, And this, I think, is something that the Bush administration, part of which anyway, that it would agree with, I think is a way of honoring Eleanor Roosevelt's legacy. We have to reform the United Nations. The UN Security Council is the lone arbiter of the balancing act between peace on the one hand and justice on the other. They don't always go together, as we learned recently in Liberia. Between decisions about when to abstain from using force and when force is required to enhance international peace and security. It has a tremendous burden, the UN Security Council. It places the stamp of legitimacy on state behavior. And yet, in its composition, I think most of us would agree, there's something kind of illegitimate about it. I mean, of the permanent 5 members who have the veto, who have the power, again, to decide when force should be deployed or when it should be withheld. We have Russia, which is committing massive human rights abuses, massive crimes against humanity, and even, you know, there are those who say are even on the verge of committing something resembling genocide in Chechnya. There's China, which has, to say the least, an unillustrious human rights record. There's the United States, which doesn't allow itself to be hemmed in by international law. Again, not to put the United States in the same camp as, you know, Russia for its activities in Chechnya, but in the eyes of the rest of the world, we are the aggressor of late. We're more of an aggressor than Russia because we've left our own borders. Just again, one doesn't have to defer to the rest of the world all the time, but it's worth knowing how we're seen and also how this Security Council is seen. Needless to say that the Security Council composition, Britain, France, China, Russia, and the United States, these are the World War II victors. Well, France thrown in just for as a sop. But those are the World War II victors. What about representativeness now in today's world? What about just even on the basis of population? If the war on terrorism is the defining event of our time, can we really persist in having no country from the Middle East, no country with much of an Islamic tradition at all represented on this Security Council in any kind of permanent way? It needs attention. There are lots of things we could do. We could sort of decide that the Security Council no longer has the legitimacy that we once gave it, so we don't consider it sort of one-stop shopping. And we come up, maybe the Secretary General himself has to be the authorizer. Would we vest that power in him? Well, the United States probably wouldn't. Other countries might. The problem with Security Council reform, which is so important to getting the international system right, is that, of course, it will be the permanent 5 members who will have to go along with reform. Indeed, who will have to encourage it. It's the permanent 5 who will have to choose to vest authority in the United Nations. And unfortunately, most of the permanent 5 members, while they will bash the United Nations, will do very little to strengthen it. Very little to give Kofi Annan, for instance, a standing army or something that he could call upon if a genocide threatened tomorrow in Burundi, or in Gujarat in India, or in Aceh in Indonesia. There are so many cases where these kinds of crimes could happen again, and yet we are dependent on states to do the ponying up or the cowboying up, as is being said these days in Boston. States don't pony up for things outside their perceived national interest, again, unless we all get involved. 7th, finally, in my power doctrine, and this again is where you come in, we as citizens have to begin holding our leaders accountable on foreign policy. We've got to make noise when a policy doesn't accord with our values. When the press and the public and the opposition party in the Congress, now the Democratic Party, go silent, when dissent disappears, as I think really did happen for the 1.5 years, maybe even 2 years since 9/11, only in the last couple months have you start to see a brewing of confrontation and new ideas and so on. If that dissent goes silent, the executive branch will be lulled into believing that it is on the right track, or worse, as was said earlier, that there's only one model for progress. One of the reasons those of us who believe in affirmative action believe in it is because we actually think it's a really good thing to get lots of people in the room who come from different places. You actually learn a lot, it turns out. And the problem with a society that shuts down or that defers to one branch of government, to the executive branch, is not only is it at odds with the checks and balances and with the system that is central to what we believe is great about America, but it deprives us of the insights that diversity actually offers. And we have had quite a homogenous approach to foreign policy and its construction, I have to say, since 9/11. A plurality of voices is crucial if we are ever to achieve a clarity of vision. I've been speaking somewhat critically of the government and about most of us as bystanders. But one of the remarkable things that I discovered in my research was that in every case of genocide in the 20th century, there were, in fact, these upstanders like Eleanor, people who defied logic, risked their careers and lives, and spoke up on behalf of distant victims. I'm just going to tell you about a couple of them. Raphael Lemkin, a Polish Jew, born 1901. He tried in 1933 to get lawyers at the League of Nations to outlaw the crime of what he called race murder. He was laughed out of the conference. Lemkin, they said, this crime that you describe, it takes place too seldom to legislate. 6 years later, Hitler would invade Poland, and Lemkin would lose 49 members of his family in the Holocaust. In 1941, Lemkin, who had managed to escape Poland and eventually end up in the United States, heard a broadcast delivered by Winston Churchill in which the British Prime Minister said, "We are in the presence of a crime without a name." Churchill was, of course, not talking about the extermination of the Jews, but Lemkin heard what he wanted to hear. He told himself, he so wanted to believe in the international community, in the possibility of international law being a force for good, that he told himself if he'd only had the right word, if he hadn't used the phrase race murder back in 1933, that it all would have been so very different. That maybe then in the League of Nations they would have banded together and stopped Hitler's crimes before they reached their apex. Maybe the Holocaust would have been averted. Maybe his family members would still be alive. He thought he needed a word, a name, that would connote the ultimate moral imperative, and thus that would trigger action, the kind of action he was hoping for in the mid-30s. In 1944, having landed here in the United States and joined the War Department in Washington, Raphael Lemkin invented the word genocide. He then drafted the Genocide Convention, the first ever UN human rights treaty, which committed states to preventing and punishing genocide when it occurred. Lemkin hounded the delegates in the halls of the new United Nations. His briefcase was bulging with gruesome case studies, the Mongols, the Japanese Catholics, the Armenians. He'd come running after these diplomats, and they were run for cover at the sight of this harried Holocaust survivor coming after them, tie-flapping genocide story at the ready. In the end, probably as a way of getting rid of Lemkin, the delegates at the new UN agreed to vote for his law. The United States did too. The Genocide Convention passed the General Assembly unanimously in 1948, committing states to prevent and punish the ultimate crime. But for the same reason that we reject the International Criminal Court today, the U.S. Senate then, back in 1948, decided to reject the genocide ban. Southern senators back then were afraid that they'd be accused of genocide for their Jim Crow laws or for their lynchings. The passive majority in this country, for sure, would have favored ratification, but the vocal isolationist minority carried the day. They got out of their chairs. Lemkin died in 1959 alone and broken. Genocide raged on. In 1967, William Proxmire, the idiosyncratic senator from Wisconsin, was shocked to learn that a genocide convention existed and that it was still unratified in the U.S. Senate. He stood up on the Senate floor and innocently pledged to give a speech a day for as long as it took to get this UN Human Rights Treaty through the Senate. He thought it would take a year at most, that it was just some kind of glitch in the ratification process. 19 years and 3,211 speeches, original speeches later, 19 years of daily speeches later, Proxmire was still rising on the Senate floor, making the case for the Genocide Convention. In 1988, the United States finally passed the law, but that same year, as I mentioned, Saddam Hussein's regime began gassing the Kurds, and that was again the same year where our aid package was doubled. American history is filled with loners like Lemkin and Proxmire, loners who defy convention, loners who stand up while the herd stands by. These men didn't succeed in any conventional way. Their efforts, in fact, failed in the short term, and they were written off by the mainstream as emotional and irrational. What is extraordinary about the world that you will all enter is the way in which the values that define you now go unspoken later. Indeed, if you speak about values or make arguments about what is the right thing to do, you may not get invited to the next meeting. The lingua franca of our world is not that of values, but of interests. Security interests, economic interests, institutional interests, career interests. Stopping genocide, advancing human rights, giving money to African health clinics so they can make a dent in treating and preventing AIDS, the greatest single pandemic of our time. We can all argue that these are noble things to do, but when the issue actually comes before us in a world of limited resources and with limited time, short-term interests trump. The upstanders, in fact, usually feel like they are failures, and they often pay a hefty professional and personal price. But look at what the men I mentioned eventually achieved. The UN War Crimes Tribunal, I actually just was there yesterday, just got back from the UN War Crimes Tribunal at The Hague. It's now prosecuting Slobodan Milosevic for genocide. Milosevic would not be on trial today at The Hague if Lemkin had not invented the word genocide, drafted his convention, or paved the way for the creation of an ad hoc court. It was the United States that took the lead in pressing Serbia to turn Milosevic over. It could not have done so if Proxmire had not prattled on for 19 years and secured the belated ratification of the Genocide Convention. You never know. You never know how what you do today will affect the world tomorrow. You have the power with your sight and your voices to cause ripples to flow. The impact of your actions will be measured later. One final point. My book, as you know, has received a shocking number of awards in the last year. And you too, if you go on and continue to be so studious, will probably be showered with promotions and accolades in your lives. But I think it's really important not to confuse personal success with the success of your cause. While my book on American responses to genocide has been racking up prizes, genocide has been unfolding in the Congo. While my book, Summoning a Different Brand of American Foreign Policy, has been nibbling its way onto the bestseller list, although not in California, America has never been more despised around the world for its unilateralism, its apparent messianism, however you say that, or what others see to be its militarism. The system is broken, and we all have to put our heads together to try to fix it. You are the 9/11 generation. Half of you, I think, had just arrived on campus when the world imploded. You will have great personal success, of that I have no doubt, but being a part of the 9/11 generation carries with it, I think, a special responsibility. Eleanor Roosevelt understood something profound about the way America engaged with the world. The United States, she said, is the world's show window of the democratic processes in action. In her day, she said that the people who looked in the show window, see what she said, Little Rock and Baton Rouge and New Orleans. They see Albany, Georgia. They see the deep-rooted prejudice, the stubborn ignorance of large groups of our citizens, which have led to injustice, inequality, and sometimes even brutality. That was what Eleanor thought people saw in her day. Today, that show window at home offers a glimpse at child care credits being cut, jobless rates increasing by the day, cities going bankrupt, schools decaying. And in Utah, I'm told, we're going to see 2 men executed later this year by firing squad. Abroad, the show window shows us standing idly by for an entire decade as a continent disappears at the hands of AIDS. It sees us finally now funding AIDS, but the money is coming out of child mortality and TB program funding. We see American foreign policymakers setting their sights on new targets for regime change, even as new recruits gather for terrorist attacks. We see American and European farm subsidies demolishing the economies of those same African countries told that they need to appreciate the virtues of free trade. And we see America not taking part, but taking aim at international institutions like the International Criminal Court, the Kyoto Protocol, and the landmines ban. There's so much to be done, so very much, and the show window doesn't present an inspired picture. During World War II, Arthur Koestler described those frustrated few who spoke up in the newspapers and public meetings against Nazi atrocities as screamers. The screamers succeeded in reaching listeners for a moment, Koestler wrote, only to watch them shake themselves like puppies who got their fur wet and return to the blissful place of ignorance and uninvolvement. You can convince them for an hour, Koestler said, but then their mental health half-defense begins to work, and in a week, the shrug of incredulity has returned. The screamers, some of whom I've mentioned, often appear overly credulous and politically obtuse. But how many of us who look back at the 20th century don't believe that Lemkin and Proxmire were right? How many of us don't believe that the presidents, senators, bureaucrats, journalists, and ordinary citizens who did nothing, choosing to look away rather than to face the hard choices and wrenching moral dilemmas, were wrong? And how can something so clear in retrospect become so muddled at the time by rationalizations, institutional constraints, and above all, a lack of imagination? How can it be that those who fight on behalf of these principles are the ones deemed unreasonable? George Bernard Shaw once wrote, "The reasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable one persists in trying to adapt the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable man." My hope, and I'm sure the hope of all of your teachers here, is that you students help enshrine Eleanor Roosevelt's legacy in more than brick and mortar, that you join, in fact, the ranks of the unreasonable. Thank you. Okay, the question was, in a sense, why are we so critical of the Bush administration, or why some of us so critical of the Bush administration, when at last we have a case where a brutal regime that committed genocide, the most ghastly form of genocide perhaps of the 90s in terms of what a chemical weapons death actually looks like, but why, I mean, isn't this a good thing that we've gone into Iraq and gotten rid of him? Is that fair? Yeah. Okay, well, I'll tell you why I personally had some concerns, more than some concerns, about the intervention. It was clear that the government in Washington, I was very conflicted, I should say, about the intervention because of the brutality of the regime, for sure. I don't think dogmatism for the war or against the war, I couldn't understand it. I mean, it seemed to me a very, very complex question. But one has to plunk. You gotta figure out where you stand, even if it's just one side of one line. And it was clear to me that the Bush administration had, as you indicated, given us several reasons for going into war in Iraq. One of which, of course, was potential link to terrorism, not necessarily Al-Qaeda, but Saddam's outspoken desire to help the families of suicide bombers and the like. Another was, of course, weapons of mass destruction. A third was the oil interests, I suppose. A fourth some said, was a desire to redeem something that his father had not finished, in a sense, to get the job done. A fifth, and I think actually quite a prominent one, was also really just to restore American credibility, or to kind of to make America a more feared power around the world, which can have positive security consequences as people, don't want to test you. And then somewhere on that list, fourth, sixth, seventh, I don't know where it belonged, but was human rights and liberation. Now, inherent in your question is an attitude that I have often, which is, well, what difference does it make if it's last on the list, if it has the effect of getting rid of this monster and liberating these people? Then so what? If it's fifth, at least it's there, at least we care. And I tell you, I had two reasons for being nervous about the war. One was that one of the things I think I've learned through looking at other interventions, is that the ranking, that where human rights appears on your list actually tells you a lot about the kind of preparation you're going to do for a war. So it actually, to me, motives to me don't matter transcendentally, or because I need purity of heart. And I agree with you that certainly all of us have to have the right to change our minds and to say we screwed up in the 80s. That was the mistaken policy. He's a monster, now we're getting it right. But my fear was that because human rights was pretty low down, it certainly wasn't up there in the top 3, and it was kind of tacked on, it felt quite late as it was clear we weren't getting much traction with the other arguments. I just feared that motive was going to tell me all I needed to know about means and follow-through. That motive was going to tell me, frankly, whether you were going to park a tank at the oil ministry or at the hospitals. It was going to tell me whether we'd spend a year on the reconstruction plan or a week, or 2 weeks, I think is what we actually spent on the reconstruction plan. So motive becomes a decent proxy, I think, for resources in a way, and commitments. Now we're in this mess and we've got to find those resources, but I think a lot of the failure to plan for some of what we've seen grew out of I think your argument, the argument that would have most moved you or me, being a little too low on people's list. And that, again, I think is unfortunately the nature of statecraft. It's not unique to this administration by any means. The second reason I was very nervous about the war, and this may sound quite cowardly as one who spent so long documenting genocide, and quite at odds with everything I've just said tonight, but I do think that every debate about the use of military force, because having seen war, it really is the worst thing possible that you could imagine inflicting on anyone. So that every debate about whether to use military force, whether in Rwanda, in Iraq back in '88, in Iraq today, has to be a cost-benefit analysis where you take into account just what you're taking into account, which is the welfare of the Iraqis, where you take into account ultimately the ripple effect. I mean, it's all kind of speculation, but what you think will be the ripple effect on the region. You take into account what the effect on U.S. security is going to be. And the irony of the intervention for me was that while it was clearly a war made because of more traditional interests rather than liberation, which was, again, a factor but not a driving factor, it was clearly about enhancing U.S. security. And yet my feeling was that this intervention, because of the level of anti-Americanism around the world, and because I didn't feel like we'd done enough, I mentioned a la carteism, to kind of, in a sense, to have anything in the bank when we went to the international community making your argument and making these other arguments, I actually felt that even though in the end it had to make Iraq a more humane place. I didn't know how long it would take, but that even if human rights were low on the list at the beginning, that eventually we would have to stabilize the place. So it had to become more humane, but that it would make the world so much more dangerous place. That was my feeling. And so for the same reason that even I describe Russian atrocities in Chechnya, because Russia is a nuclear power, in my cost-benefit analysis, I don't say, oh, we got to invade Russia, right? Iraq, of course, was not at that scale, but I really did feel like the sort of legitimation of preemption and really just the number of terrorist recruits we would be creating by not just in the place where terrorist recruits are normally created, but just by the extent of global opposition and by the unilateral nature of the attack. I was very disturbed. I would have felt, I think, quite differently if I had felt that Saddam was posing, and this sounds totally legalistic perhaps, but like a proximate threat to a large number of people. In other words, if Halabja were today and not 15 years ago, but to me it felt like it was we were invoking the genocide retrospectively. We were getting rid of a tyrant for sure, but it didn't feel like it felt like we were inflicting a lot of harm and risking an awful lot of danger for quite an uncertain humanitarian outcome without the urgency of something like a genocide at stake. I can definitely see arguments to the contrary, but I think it's really important that in the future, because there is a good argument for overthrowing someone like him, I mean, for humanitarian reasons, that's why it's essential that I think the United States has the credibility and legitimacy to speak on behalf of those principles. And that requires not simply focusing on the four corners of Iraq, but really looking at foreign policy as a whole. But thank you for the question.
Samantha Power flew overnight from Amsterdam, arriving last night in order to be with us here today, and flies out early tomorrow morning to be in New York for something. So please join me in thanking her for taking extraordinary steps to be with us.